Hide the women and children. This was the warning of an Atlanta newspaper in 1993 when the Phillies came to town to play the Braves. By all accounts, they had good reason to warn. The 1993 Phillies were, by their own words, a bunch of hard-partying, hard-drinking children. They were also as good as any team in baseball. They were a blue-collar group of misfits that came out of nowhere to be one of baseball's elite. They conquered the team of the 90s in the NLCS, and then came one giant swing away from forcing a Game 7 against the reigning world champs. This team had absolutely no reason to be this good. Nobody on their roster ever won an MVP or a Cy Young, and no 93 Phillies made the Hall of Fame. They hadn't made the postseason since 1983, and wouldn't make it again until 2007. It was the only season from 1987 to 2000 where the Phillies even finished over 500. This is the story of the greatest one-hit wonder in baseball history. This is the story of the 1993 Phillies. It's 1992. The Phillies are predictably bad. With 70 wins and a last-place finish, the Phillies have their 6th consecutive losing season and 9th straight missing the playoffs. Their offense is pretty good, but the pitching staff is absolutely atrocious. The 1992 Phillies give up 49 more runs than any other team in the National League, and their team ERA plus of 86 ties for the lowest in baseball. This is a pitching staff that averages out to be 14% worse than the league average pitcher. With pitching that bad, any sort of significant success feels impossible. All expectations are that the Phillies will be bad again in 1993. Maybe people should have expected more though. The 1992 Phillies, while a bad team, had the pieces to be a contender the following season. Their offense had scored the 2nd most runs in the National League in 1992. Only the Pirates, who were a bad Barry Bonds throw from the pennant that year, scored more in the NL. This was a good offense in Philadelphia, and they returned all of their key contributors on that side. Catcher Darren Daulton was coming off of a 6th-place MVP finish, and would finish 7th in voting in 1993. First baseman John Kruk was coming off of a 14th-place finish in his own right. Dave Hollins was a good third baseman, and would make his lone All-Star appearance in 1993. They had been the top 3 position players on the 1992 team by WAR, and would all make up key parts of the lineup in 93. There had been holes on the 1992 pitching staff, but new ace Curt Schilling had moved from the bullpen that season to become a dominant starter. Of everyone on this Phillies team, it was Schilling who came by far the closest to making the Hall of Fame. Joining Schilling, Tommy Green came off an injury-riddled 1992 to be a quality piece of the Phillies' rotation. Terry Mulholland was another rotation piece who had a quality year, making his only career All-Star game in his age 30 season. The key to it all, though, was a scrappy leadoff man who had a career high of 10 home runs. With the help of a lot of steroids and private investigators, he would break out and become the MVP runner-up in 1993. His name was Lenny Dykstra. Every player I just mentioned was also on the 1992 team, and they all had career years in 1993. Aside from Curt Schilling, who had a bit of a down year, every single player I just mentioned had either their best or second best B-WAR in a season that year. With key additions in the bullpen and outfield, and a better season from closer Mitch Williams, the Phillies had a very good roster on their hands virtually overnight. Almost as important as the construction of the roster, though, was the incredible chemistry developing in the Philadelphia clubhouse. It was a group that genuinely liked each other, and loved playing baseball. They had a leadership core featuring 6 of the top players on the team, all 6 of whom had lockers next to each other in the far corner of the clubhouse. Amongst the players, this area was referred to as the ghetto. To those on the outside, it was known as Macho Row. This blue-collar group endeared themselves to fans and teammates alike, combining a serious edge with the sort of loyalty and humor that could bring together a locker room. Nowhere was this more apparent than in the training room after a Phillies game. On a nightly basis, the members of Macho Row would make their way to the training room after games, talking baseball there well into the morning.
This is the burial ground. This is where every pitcher, every player, and no one was immune to it. Daulton, Dykstra, myself, if we played bad or made bad mistakes, mental mistakes, we all got buried in this room. And this is the greatest place. This is where our team came together. And this is where we actually won and lost games in here to take it out there for the next day.
Only on a team this together and bought in could we have seen what happened in spring training of that year. In a March 21st game against the Cardinals, St. Louis pitcher Donovan Osborne drilled Dave Hollins. The third baseman brushed it off and jogged casually to first, making the situation appear like it was over. In reality, though, it was only the beginning. Hollins had told the pitching staff before the season that they were to protect their hitters, or else. The exact words? If you're not going to protect our hitters, there's going to be a problem between you and me. I'm going to be the first one to come after you if one of our guys gets hit and you don't do something about it. It was Tommy Green, a man considered one of the nicer on the team, whose job it was to deliver the response when Osborne came up to the plate in the third. Darren Daulton put down the middle finger, the universal sign to throw at the batter. Green delivered, and his pitch hit the Cardinal hurler in the neck. Later in the game, a Cardinal reliever nailed Ricky Jordan, who charged the mound, initiating a spring training benches clearing brawl. When everything cooled down, Jordan had been ejected from the game, but the message had been sent. The Phillies were not going to take anything from anyone. Be it for whatever reason, the Phillies came out of the gate on fire when the regular season came around. They swept their opening series, and ended the month of April 16-5. It was the best record to that point in the season in Phillies history. It had also catapulted them into first place. They reached 20 wins above 500 on May 30th, not only giving them a 7-game lead on the Expos in the NL East, but the best start in franchise history. The Phillies have been playing baseball since 1883, and only 2 other times have they won 34 of their first 48 games in a season. The 1976 Phillies had 3 Hall of Famers, and will have a 4th whenever Dick Allen is rightfully enshrined, while the 2024 Phillies are coming off back-to-back NLCS appearances. Joining those 2 teams with their 34-14 start, we have the 1993 Phillies. It was an all-time great start, but a nearly 115-win pace was never going to be sustainable. With Dave Hollins out for 2 weeks with a fractured hamate bone, the Phillies entered July as losers of 4 of 5. Having followed a 2-game sweep at the hands of Pittsburgh by losing 3 of 4 in St. Louis, the division lead had fallen to 5.5 games. It was a team suddenly in a bit of a slump, but in the middle of this slump, the Phillies had one of the more unique wins in baseball history. It was July 2nd, and Philadelphia was set to host San Diego at the Vet for a doubleheader. The first game, scheduled for 4:35, got delayed multiple times and didn't end until 1 o'clock in the morning. By the time the second game was starting, it was nearly 1:30. Worse yet, the Phillies went down 5-0 with league ERA leader Andy Benes on the mound for San Diego. Benes cruised into the 8th, when Philadelphia fought back to tie it up. As the game went into the bottom of the 10th, there were 2 runners on with closer Mitch Williams coming up. What happened next, at 4:40 in the morning with the closer at the plate, was a moment for the ages. This was Mitch Williams' only at-bat of 1993. He would end his year 1-for-1 with an RBI. All things considered, this remarkable win was a short reprieve from a relative lull in the Phillies' success. Having led the East by as many as 11.5 games in early June, that number had dwindled to just 5 by the time the Midsummer Classic had come around. Regardless, the team was still well represented at Camden Yards for the All-Star game. Coming off the bench at third was Dave Hollins, who was joined by 3 starters. John Kruk was starting at first, having posted a blistering .350 average and 1,008 OPS in the first half. Catching was Darren Daulton, who had slugged 15 home runs and walked as much as he struck out in the first half. Lastly, starting on the mound for the National League was Terry Mulholland, whose 2.72 ERA was 3rd in the NL at the break. As the team with the second best record in baseball at the All-Star break, this game was certainly representing the Phillies as such. Perhaps most importantly for the stretch run, though, was one of their non-All-Stars catching fire. The all-time great start for Philadelphia had come in spite of a relatively slow start from Lenny Dykstra. His OPS had fallen below 700 in the middle of May, at a point when the team was still 27-11. He had crawled his way back to make it an .877 OPS at the All-Star break with a .297 average. His OPS would never fall below that .877 mark after July 20th, and he would finish the year hitting .305 with a .902 OPS. He finished as the league leader in hits, runs, and walks, and finished second in doubles. The spark plug had emerged as a star, and it ended up being exactly what the Phillies needed. They would go just 7 games above 500 in the second half, keeping themselves relatively on track on the back of Dykstra's elite play. The team would see its division lead fall to just 3 games, but would never lose it. For the first time in 10 years, the Phillies were going to the postseason. Awaiting Philadelphia for the NLCS was an absolute juggernaut, the Atlanta Braves. Atlanta was not only loaded, but after back-to-back World Series defeats, they were hungry. This was a matchup of 2 entirely opposite rosters. The best offense in the league, comprised of almost entirely cast-offs from other teams, was facing off against the best pitching staff in baseball, built largely on homegrown studs. The '93 Braves had not only the best staff in the NL, but one of the best rotations in the history of baseball. This staff had 3 homegrown aces, a collection of arms that would combine to win 3 Cy Youngs and 3 playoff series MVPs. This group included Hall of Famers Tom Glavine and John Smoltz, and young stud Steve Avery, who actually had a better '93 than either of them. On top of that, the reigning back-to-back NL champs had added the '92 Cy Young to their staff, an arm that would win the award again in each of his first 3 seasons in Atlanta. He was Hall of Famer Greg Maddux. The '98 Braves get a lot of talk as the best rotation in baseball history, but I honestly think that this group may have been better. This version had prime Steve Avery. It's a Braves team that as a whole combines for 2 career MVPs, 8 Cy Youngs, and 5 Hall of Famers. The Phillies roster didn't have a single one of any of those. When you compare the sheer star power of this Braves team with the scrappy underdogs from Philadelphia, it feels like a mismatch. Nobody seemed to have let the Phillies know that, though. Getting things started on the mound for the home Phillies in the NLCS, making his first career postseason start, was the 26-year-old Curt Schilling. Little did anyone know, but one of the best playoff pitchers in history was about to make his postseason debut.
Made a huge difference, and Schilling strikes out the side in the first. The 1-2 from Griff and Nolan Ryan. There's number 5.
Statement sent. This was the first time in the history of the League Championship Series that a pitcher had begun a game with 5 straight strikeouts. Moreover, the Phillies cashed a leadoff double by Dykstra in for a first-inning run. 1-0 Philadelphia. It was Steve Avery who would double and score to tie it in the third, and a run apiece made it 2-2 at the end of the fourth. That second run was all Atlanta would get off of Curt Schilling. His final line, 8 innings, 2 runs, 8 strikeouts. He left with a 3-2 lead and a pitch count of 135. Entering was the wild thing, Mitch Williams, but he was not the only one. Dave Hollins was an all-star caliber third baseman, but after coming back from his injury in late June, he had a rough defensive stretch, and manager Jim Fregosi had begun using Kim Batiste as a defensive sub. They say the ball always finds the new guy, and it did to start the 9th. Williams, who is famously wild, began the inning with a walk, and the next ball went to Batiste. In this instance, the defensive replacement had a defensive gaffe. With the game being tied 2 batters later, Game 1 was on its way into extra innings. Coming up with a runner in scoring position in the 10th was none other than Kim Batiste.
Down the line, fair ball! Into the left field corner. Truck around to score, and Kim Batiste goes from goat to hero in a matter of minutes.
This began a series that was in many ways the polar opposite of what was expected. In a matchup of an elite offense versus an elite pitching staff, most had anticipated the Phillies to win the shootouts and the Braves to take the pitcher's duels. Instead, it was the Braves offense dominating games 2 and 3, and Philly winning close games 4 and 5 to take a 3-2 lead back to Philadelphia. It was Maddux versus Green in Game 6, and facing off against one of the greatest pitchers in baseball history, the Phillies offense ripped the Hall of Famer. By the time Maddux left with 2 away in the 6th, he had allowed a 2 RBI double, a 2 RBI triple, and a 2-run home run. The Phillies had put 6 runs on one of the greatest pitchers to ever live, and up 5 runs going into the late innings, they wouldn't look back. The final was Phillies 6, Braves 3. The Philadelphia Phillies had toppled the best team in baseball. The Philadelphia Phillies had won the pennant. The matchups weren't getting any easier. The 1993 Blue Jays were a season removed from winning Canada its first World Series, and were running out a team that was equally fierce. Their offense was led by 4 top 12 MVP finishers, with Hall of Famers Paul Molitor and Roberto Alomar, right fielder Joe Carter, and first baseman John Olerud, who had an absolutely monster year. They also had legendary postseason ace Dave Stewart, and coming over at that year's deadline had been the greatest leadoff hitter of all time, Rickey Henderson. Battling with Toronto was a Phillies team whose pitching was more or less lined up, with NLCS MVP Curt Schilling starting in Game 1. He got shelled. The Blue Jays pounced on Schilling for 7 runs, 6 earned. Game 1 to Toronto, 8-5. After a Philadelphia bounce back in Game 2, Toronto's offense again pounced on Philly pitching, putting up 10 runs to take a 2-1 lead. Through 3 games, Toronto had put up over 7 runs a game. The Phillies pitching staff was getting ripped. The Jays increased that average in Game 4, but Philadelphia took a 14-9 lead into the 8th inning. Then disaster struck. A single walk-in error off Larry Anderson cut the lead to 4. With Mitch Williams entering the game, he allowed 2 singles, a walk, and a triple. In 1 inning, Toronto had erased a 5-run deficit and taken the lead. Final score, Blue Jays 15, Phillies 14. It was heartbreak at the vet. Toronto had taken a 3-1 lead. It took a Curt Schilling complete game shutout on 147 pitches to force a Game 6. You probably know how Game 6 of the 1993 World Series ended, but what you might not know is that the Phillies, with their backs against the wall, were down 5-1 going into the 7th inning of that game. A sac fly, an RBI single, and Lenny Dykstra's 4th home run of the series were what it took to give Philadelphia a lead going into the late innings. This was the 5th different game of the series that the Phillies held a lead in, 4 of which included leads of more than 1 run. Unfortunately for Philadelphia, though, the end of Game 6 went the same way 2 of those other games went. The Phillies wouldn't get to a position like this again for well over a decade. They fell back to below 500 in 1994, and again in 95, and again every year after that until 2001, when a young core led by Roland Abreu and Rollins got to 86 wins and a 2nd place finish. The Phillies were bad for at least 5 years before 1993, and again for the next 7 years after. Of the 6 best players on the 1993 Phillies by B-WAR, only Dave Hollins ever again had a season where he recorded over 50% of his total from 1993. It was a team where virtually everyone had career years at the same time. 30 years later, they are left with a complicated legacy. Amongst the 6 members of Macho Row, only John Kruk and Mitch Williams have not been connected to performance-enhancing drugs in some way. Of those, only Dykstra has admitted to it publicly. In spite of all of that, the team is still well remembered by their fans. Their throwback, blue-collar approach to baseball made them beloved in Philadelphia both then and still to this day. The personalities of the 93 Phillies were so popular with the fans that 4 of the 5 primary color commentators for the team today were players on that team. They played hard on the field and partied hard off of it. They had one incredible year in the middle of over a decade of losing. They shocked the world and won the pennant out of nowhere. They were the greatest one-hit wonder in baseball history. They were the 1993 Phillies.